of the major warring powers to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues have been determined on the battlefields of the world. Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always.
World War II was over. After 6 years of agony, a war-weary world had agreed to lay down its arms. 3 months before the surrender of Japan, Germany had admitted defeat in Europe. Axis dreams of world conquest had been turned into unconditional surrender and total defeat.
United, the peace-loving nations have demonstrated that their arms are stronger by far than the might of dictators or the tyranny of military cliques that once called us. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
The United Nations victory had been a triumph of a coalition of allies who fought a war of survival against Nazi and fascist aggression in Europe and Asia. Of all the occupied nations that had never ceased to hope for the day of liberation. The joys of victory, however, could not wipe away the grim realities of peace. The misery of a world in chaos and ruin. The victors had to face the immediate and pressing problems of reconstruction, relief and rehabilitation, rebuilding, repatriation of the millions of displaced persons who had been used as slave laborers by the German war machine. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, had been created to plan and administer
measures for the relief of victims of war in any area under the control of the United Nations.
After the defeat of Japan, UNRWA carried on its activities in almost every country of Europe and Asia. For World War II had been the most widespread and destructive conflict in history. World War II had also been the most expensive war in history. Its cost staggered the imagination. But the cost of the more than 50 million persons who had died could never be measured. The victors were determined to prevent the catastrophe of war from occurring again.
We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations.
The United Nations Charter pledged its signers
to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relationships among nations, achieve cooperation in solving international problems.
If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future, in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die.
One of the most significant efforts in the quest for peace took place in the courtroom. The four wartime partners, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the United States, and France, now employed the moral force of international law. The first of the international war crimes trials was held in Nuremberg, Germany, and lasted nearly 1 year. The defendants were charged with
conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity in the course of preparation for war and in the course of the prosecution of the war.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility, and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated.
the trial at Nuremberg represented an effort to hold German leaders accountable for the atrocities of the Nazis, for the mass murder of innocent people, and the many crimes committed against humanity. International tribunals sat in judgment at Tokyo and Manila, as well as at Nuremberg. For the first time, preparing and waging aggressive war was judged a crime. This was a new concept of international law, one which gave legal authority to principles embodied in the United Nations Charter. The UN Charter had a special meaning to the peoples of the colonial empires of Asia. Its support of equal rights and self-determination spurred on native demands for independence. The entire continent was swept by a strong surge of nationalism. Protest marches and demonstrations, guerrilla warfare, discussions and negotiations, passive resistance, all were used to achieve a common goal: independence for the peoples of Asia. The great wave of social and political unrest sweeping across the Orient was just one of many fundamental changes occurring throughout the world. Changes hastened into being as a result of World War II. Among the industrial countries of the West, France and Great Britain had lost much of their pre-war supremacy. The balance of power in Europe had been drastically altered by the war. In its aftermath, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two most powerful nations in the world. In the new atomic age, this was the most far-reaching result of the United Nations victory. A victory given meaning
by the total defeat of the Axis, by efforts to rebuild, by punishment of the aggressors, by demands for independence in Asia, by formation of the United Nations,
and by the dominance of the United States and the Soviet Union in the post-war world. At the end of World War II, the United States was the richest nation on Earth. Its cities secure, its people well-fed. The Soviet Union provided a stark contrast. It had suffered more casualties than all the other Allied nations combined. Over 17 million Russians had died. Soviet economic losses were astronomical. More than $100 billion worth of property damage. When General Eisenhower flew into Russia in 1945, he reported that he did not see a house standing between the western borders of the country and the area around Moscow. For the Russians, victory was a strange mixture of misery and grandeur. The wartime partnership of the U.S. and USSR had been held together by immediate and common dangers. It had created a great deal of goodwill and friendship. Yet Americans feared and opposed communist ideology, and the Russians regarded the capitalist world as their natural enemy. But there had to be agreement between the Allies in the post-war period if a lasting peace was to be achieved. The basis for such a post-war settlement had been considered at the Yalta Conference. Here, it had been agreed that Russia would increase her sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It was obvious that the Soviet Union and the United States would dominate the international scene in the years ahead. Great Britain would play a far smaller role. But the Allies could not agree on the future of Poland, and Winston Churchill later commented,
Poland was to prove the first of the great causes which led to the breakdown of the Grand Alliance.
6 months later, the Polish question had become even more controversial. Poland was gradually being turned into a Russian satellite. President Harry S. Truman was now the U.S. member of the Big Three. Roosevelt had died, and Churchill had been replaced as the British representative by the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. At the Potsdam Conference, Harry Truman met Joseph Stalin for the first time. Despite mutual distrust, the Allied leaders undertook the joint occupation of Germany. Though it was obvious they didn't agree on the meaning of democracy, they pledged its establishment in the defeated country. Allied policies towards Germany lay at the crux of the differences emerging between East and West. A large portion of the Third Reich had been ceded to Poland, and a smaller section to the Soviet Union. The remainder of the country was divided into 4 zones of occupation, as agreed to at Potsdam. Deep within the Soviet zone lay Berlin, a divided city under the joint rule of the 4 occupying powers. The division of Berlin became a symbol of the widening gulf between East and West. The Allied Control Council, established by the Potsdam Agreement to provide centralized administrative and economic control of Germany, was unable to agree. Failure to sign a German peace treaty was a failure of the former Allies to reconcile their differences. At the Paris Peace Conference, peace treaties with Italy and the Nazi satellite countries were debated and argued over for many months. The continual disputes between the communist and non-communist powers caused one observer to comment,
The real peace we need now is between the East and the West.
Eventually, the treaties were signed in February 1947. Just 1 month earlier, Poland had finally held its first national election since the end of the war. The communists won overwhelmingly. But 2 years had elapsed since these elections had originally been promised at Yalta. Great Britain and the United States considered Soviet interference in Polish affairs a breach of the Yalta and Potsdam agreements. The Russians, on the other hand, maintained that Soviet security was at stake. Poland was one of a group of communist-controlled buffer states in the middle of the continent. They separated the Soviet Union from Western Europe. By 1947, all the Central European nations, having a common border with Russia, were communist satellites, except Czechoslovakia. And Winston Churchill had coined a phrase.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
At the United Nations, representatives from both sides of the Iron Curtain met. They frequently clashed. Soviet behavior in the Security Council often angered the American delegation. the Soviet Union used its right of veto to prevent any action it disapproved of. If this was not possible, it adopted other forms of non-cooperation. When the Security Council voted to consider a complaint of the government of Iran against the Soviet Union, the Russian delegation withdrew in protest. It remained absent from the council meetings for nearly 2 weeks. But far more disturbing to the Western powers was Soviet rejection of the American plan for control of atomic energy.
The atomic bomb is too dangerous to be loose in a lawless world.
The United States had proposed an international atomic authority, coupled with a system of worldwide inspection and control. The U.S. promised to surrender all of its atomic bombs to this authority as soon as the inspection system was in operation. The Soviet Union, however, found the American plan unacceptable. In the years immediately following World War II, Soviet policies clashed with those of the United States, and American attitudes conflicted with Russian attitudes on many issues.
The occupation of Germany, human rights in Poland and Eastern Europe, writing of the peace treaties, the role of the United Nations, international control of atomic energy.
Differences on all these questions contributed to the breakup of the Grand Alliance. After their victory in World War II, the first wish of the American people had been to get the boys home. During the next 2 years, the United States drastically reduced its armed forces, from over 16 million men to 1.5 million. But the country realized it could never again retreat into isolation. In 1945, it was a question of how much and what sort of involvement in foreign affairs. Relief supplies of all kinds were shipped overseas for distribution by UNRWA and private American organizations. Congress voted large sums for foreign economic aid and granted loans for the rebuilding of war-torn economies. Economic assistance soon became a weapon in the developing struggle between East and West. Despite demobilization, U.S. military bases were maintained throughout the world. Occupation troops remained in Germany and Japan to carry out the mission of the American military governments. In France and Italy, the increased strength and influence of the national communist parties posed a major threat to U.S. post-war diplomacy. Great pressure was exerted to exclude the communists from the governments of these two countries. During this early post-war period, United States foreign policy was frequently criticized. Critics, both at home and abroad, charged the State Department with failure to take the initiative in international affairs, accused it of acting only in response to communist actions. While the U.S. did not attempt to challenge the status quo in Eastern Europe, it continued to add to its global commitments. It established the United States Information Service to present the American viewpoint and to counter communist propaganda around the world. As the leader of the free world, the United States assumed many political, economic, and military responsibilities previously exercised by Great Britain. The most significant of these responsibilities was in the Balkans, where the gateway to the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. Whoever controls Turkey controls the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, the two waterways essential for passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Control of these straits had been a Russian dream for over 200 years. To the Russians, communist domination of the Balkans seemed reasonable, even essential. But to the Western powers, Russian designs on Greece and Turkey were further evidence of Soviet imperialism. In February 1947, the United States was informed that economic necessity dictated withdrawal of British aid to Greece. When English troops first arrived in 1944, Greece had been torn by civil war. Great Britain gave her support to the right-wing forces against the largely communist-led resistance movement. This resulted in a negotiated peace and a coalition government. But civil war broke out again in 1946. England's decision to withdraw from Greece forced the United States to act. Washington was determined to thwart the Kremlin's efforts in Greece and Turkey. President Truman requested the U.S. Congress to vote military and economic aid.
To support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
The Congress overwhelmingly approved the Truman Doctrine, the name given to the legislation aiding Greece and Turkey. The Truman Doctrine brought Washington and Moscow into a direct conflict of interests. It marked the initial step in the new United States policy of containment, a policy based on the premise that further Soviet expansion could only be halted by determined economic, political, and military resistance. The Grand Alliance was beginning to resemble two enemy camps. Mutual suspicion and distrust were preventing agreement between the two nations that controlled the destiny of the world. It was a world divided, the battleground for the first stages of a new kind of war, the Cold War. A conflict employing political, economic, and propaganda weapons. A struggle whose front lines were everywhere. Between 1945 and 1947, a new United States foreign policy began to take shape. The U.S. had responded to the Soviet challenge.
By assuming the active leadership of the free world, by undertaking military and economic commitments around the globe, by announcing the Truman Doctrine and initiating a policy of containment.
In less than 2 years, the joys of victory, the world's high hopes for peace, had given way to the fear of a new and even more terrible conflict. Was there no way of solving the growing differences between the United States and the Soviet Union? In June of 1947, many vital issues dividing the two countries remained unresolved.